We have a large audience attending the webinar tonight, and so you'll notice that we have muted your microphone to make it easier for everyone to hear. We welcome your questions, though, and you can type them at any time using the questions area on the control panel window that you should see on your computer. We will answer any questions that we can immediately, and we'll also collect questions for Dr. Moats, and she'll have a chance to answer some of them at the end of her presentation. After tonight's talk, we also encourage you to take a look at our website. You will find lots of resources there, including previously recorded webinars, which you can watch at your convenience. There's actually another excellent one there with Dr. Moats on how spelling supports reading. And at our website, you can find information about future webinars and events, including ida-umb's 40th annual conference coming up on April 11th. While at our website, we hope you consider joining us as a member of IDA. You'll be supporting our efforts to spread awareness of dyslexia and to provide research-based information on reading instruction that works for all students. We are able to provide our webinars free of charge, thanks to the generosity of our speakers, including Dr. Moats, and the financial support that we receive from our membership. If you find this webinar valuable, Dr. Moats, you may want to mute yourself. I have a feeling that is your...
Yeah. I'm sorry.
That's all right. You can mute it and then go sort that out, and I'll introduce you in just a second. We're able to provide the webinars that you're listening to here tonight thanks to the generosity of our speakers, including Dr. Moats, and also from the financial support that we receive from our memberships. If you find this webinar valuable, please consider joining us as a member of IDA. You can find our website at ida-umb.org. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Moats, our speaker. Dr. Louisa Moats is uniquely and richly qualified to speak on the topic you'll be hearing about tonight. She has been a teacher, a practicing psychologist, a researcher, a graduate school faculty member, and she is the author of many well-respected publications on the topics of reading, spelling, language, and teacher preparation. Dr. Moats has been involved in a number of projects focused on supporting teachers and developing their knowledge and effectiveness when teaching reading, spelling, and writing. She has received numerous awards for her contributions to our understanding of language and reading, and she was instrumental in developing the IDA knowledge and practice standards for teachers of reading, which you will be hearing more about tonight. Welcome, Dr. Moats, and thank you for speaking with all of us this evening.
Thank you so much, Kelly and Sue. It's my pleasure to have this hour to talk with everyone about an issue that I have written about and talked about for many years, and it still is very much, I would say, an important and neglected issue, and that is that if we're going to implement the Common Core, for example, and if we're going to, in fact, help all kids learn to read to the best of their ability, the most important person in this equation is the teacher. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of the concepts that we really should know and be taught as teachers, and talk about why they're important, and then review some of the research that's out there that really highlights the discrepancy between what we should be able to do by virtue of our preparation and what we typically know and are taught, so that we have a basis for advocating for much better teacher support in the field and much more scientifically grounded preparation. So that will be my argument tonight. Let me start with something that we often end with in webinars like this. The research is very clear. By the research, I mean summary reports, consensus statements by scientists who write regularly for our scientific journals, summary statements by the most experienced clinicians and teachers in our field who have published and who serve as mentors for others. So what we all agree on is that when kids struggle to learn to read, unless they learn to read easily or naturally, the teacher's responsibility is to implement a program that directly teaches concepts about language, that presents those concepts systematically and explicitly, that teaches skills in a cumulative manner where one thing builds on another, where multisensory techniques are used where appropriate to reinforce associations and concepts. And we see from research that this instruction must be intensive, and that usually means that it's carried out on a daily basis, anywhere from 30 minutes a day for younger kids to 90 to 120 minutes a day for older students who experience reading difficulties. And we also know that as we develop student skills, that those must be applied in a good amount of reading and writing practice in order to stick. So those descriptors of effective instruction, I think, are reinforced in just about every arena where people who have done research or have worked over a long time with students who have reading difficulties. Now, one of the key aspects of the definition of dyslexia that we commonly use are that poor readers with the symptoms of dyslexia are typically, and notice that word typically, are not wired for phonological processing and or automatic word recognition. And why would we use the word typically? Because there are students who experience reading difficulties that don't necessarily involve overt problems with phonology, but that involve fluency in text reading and or that involve access to critical language constructs that enable them to comprehend. So reading difficulties are not simple, and they tend to be more complex than we want them to be. What does a teacher have to know? Now let's dig in, be a little bit more specific when we talk about knowledge of the structure of language and why that's important and what that has to do with phonology and word recognition. Here's a student who's a first grader, and if we look at the way this student wrote words that were dictated, we can see, and I'll just summarize this for you in the interest of time. If you look at the first 4 words, fan, pet, dig, and mob, they all have short vowels in them, and the student did not get any of those vowel representations correct. The student also confused the B on the end of mob with the sound P that was written as a P. The student also, if you look at the word chunk, number 7, the student confused the sound ch with the sound j in G. The student also confused the last sound in the word stick, number 9, with g, and somehow got an N stuck in the middle and no vowel. So you can see, looking at this quickly, that the only vowels the student tended to represent were those that were long vowels, easier to hear, or the student wrote a letter for the vowel sound that was not accurate, especially for the short vowels, and the student confused consonants that differ only in voicing. So one of the arguments I've always made is that in order to understand how students learn to spell and read and where they get tripped up and where they get confused, teachers need to know this kind of detail about the speech sound system. It's not sufficient to present teachers with a list of the consonants in English. The most important concept here is that the speech sounds of English differ according to place and manner of articulation. And in order to detect, for example, that the student is confusing the sounds ch and j, we have to develop an eye for phonological confusions, and the only way we can do that is to receive instruction ourselves on how the speech sound system is organized, how the consonant sounds differ from one another, what voicing is in consonant production, and which of these consonant pairs and which of these consonant classes are the ones that are most likely to be confused. And why would we want to know that? So that when a student is confusing ch and j, for example, our feedback to the student would target the nature of the problem. We wouldn't want to say, oh, G isn't right in that word. We'd want to say, you wrote a sound for j, and the sound in this word is ch, and we spell it with a CH. We'd also want a basis for teaching vowel sound identity. And we talk a lot about phonology and phoneme awareness, but what strikes me is how seldom we actually teach phoneme awareness to kids at the level that would be required to undo some of these confusions that kids have about what's what in the middle of a one-syllable word. So, for example, teachers will be much better equipped to teach kids about medial vowel sounds if they know how to describe the differences according to the place of articulation that vowels have in our speech sound system. And suppose you have a Spanish speaker in your classroom. You also need to be able to describe the sounds that are in Spanish and contrast them with the sounds that are in English that are not in Spanish, and so on. And the only way you can do that is to know what the vowel sound system in English is. It's also absolutely essential for us as teachers to be able to teach kids about how orthography works in English. English is complex. When we look at a word like unreachable, if we can read well, we process that word not only as an undifferentiated, or let me put it this way, we do not process it as an undifferentiated string of letters. In fact, we process it very rapidly as three morphemes in this case, a prefix, a base word, and a suffix. We also process that word in terms of its 4 syllables and pronounce that to ourselves. And we also can do that because we have already learned the individual phoneme grapheme correspondences that the syllables are made up of. And by a grapheme, I mean a letter combination that represents a speech sound, such as EA for E and CH for ch, and LE for the O on the end of that consonant LE syllable. And then, of course, the base layer of this knowledge is letter identification and letter differentiation. So if we're teaching well, we need to be equally comfortable with all of these layers of representation in English orthography. We need to be able to explain to kids how words are represented. We need to be able to say which layer of representation we're working with, because morphemic representation is not the same as syllabic representation. And that's not the same as phoneme grapheme representation. One thing I want to mention, and this is for the benefit of anyone who has been taught or is subjected to some of these ideas, there is also a lot of evidence about what does not help us learn to read. And teachers, instead of being taught what is not helpful and what does not hold up with science, we're sort of taught that, well, there are lots of different ways to do this and sort of pick what appeals to you. Well, in fact, for example, this configuration approach has nothing to do with word recognition. It's no help with word recognition in an alphabetic orthography, and the science is very clear, and yet we still have teachers being given materials where they're told to cut out the shapes of words and post them on the bulletin board and so on. And this is because their preparation hasn't gone deeply enough into the psychology of reading. And we have still very popular but misconceived methods out there that overemphasize context and word recognition. And if you really are able to learn about the psychology of reading, it's very clear that those who recognize words well do not depend on context to recognize printed words in an alphabetic orthography. Context helps us sort out the meaning of a word and facilitates word recognition over and above knowledge of phoneme, grapheme, correspondences, syllabication, and morphology, but it is not the key. So we learn to read this way, shape, through sound symbol correspondence, and then we use context to determine which meaning of shape and which grammatical role of the word is appropriate for the context of the sentence. So one of the mistakes that's made a lot in what we're taught that needs to change is that somehow the more mechanical aspects of reading, which have to do with sounding out words, spelling words, identifying the meaningful parts, and so on, is separate from meaning making, when in fact, for example, all of the work of Charles Perfetti and the best reading scientists we have show us that being able to process the form of the written word and the form of the spoken word is integral to being able to make meaning, that this is not something separate, ancillary, dispensable, or relatively irrelevant. So we need to think of all of these aspects of word knowledge as related to one another and dependent on one another. We also need to know quite a bit about language structure, and that includes syntax. This is, I'm focused on syntax with this slide because this is an area in which most of us received almost no preparation whatsoever in our teacher prep, and I'm using the term our and we because I'm just like most of you in that I did not learn any of these things in my teacher preparation many years ago. I had to get a doctorate to learn something about syntax. I don't think this is a reasonable thing for our field, and I think that we ought to ask for, as a profession, some really good instruction in how syntax works, how we get kids to be proficient at writing sentences, how we teach kids to process meaning at the level of a sentence, because meaning is constructed sentence by sentence. It's not constructed in this holistic way. It's the pieces of language that must be processed and integrated in order for us to grasp the larger whole. Reading difficulties should be differentiated. Dyslexia often is associated with problems with phonologically based word recognition, but the reality is that dyslexia also includes a subgroup of fluency-based problems and problems with memory for words, so that words are not recognized quickly and words are not recalled accurately for spelling. And we have underestimated both the prevalence of that subtype and the difference in methodologies that are required for that subtype. And then language comprehension problems overlap with these so that many students who deserve the label of dyslexia often have coexisting problems with language comprehension, with language processing, with language expression. And that's why the word dyslexia is such a good word, because it means difficulty with language. So if what we're talking about, whether it's in specific terms or more general terms pertaining to all of the kids who struggle with reading, and that's a very large proportion, at least a third. It's much more than the 5 to 10% that we talk about as ever getting the label dyslexia. If we're, as professionals, going to be ready to really teach this population in a way that they can learn and we can move them ahead and facilitate their progress with this otherwise difficult thing, we need to be prepared to help all of these subgroups and identify all of these subgroups. So that really means that we all need to be prepared to explicate for students not only the speech sound system and the writing system, but we need to be able to explicate simple to complex syntactic structures, how they work. We need to build student proficiency at that level. We certainly need to be able to show students how discourse is organized according to genre expectations. We need to be able to talk about semantic organization in teaching vocabulary, and morphology also is related to actually both semantics and to phonology and orthography. So I don't see how we've gone this long in our teacher preparation programs in English language arts and reading without requiring every aspiring professional to have a very strong course in the structure of language and in language acquisition, so we can be attuned to the needs of the students who are in front of us. Another fact that is underestimated in our preparation and a lot of the guidance we're receiving these days, especially in relation to the Common Core, is that the relative importance of these components of language changes over time. And I often use this slide in my talks if you've seen any of those, but this is from the Florida Center for Reading Research. They had 20-some thousand students in their data pool, and they showed that oral reading fluency in third grade is even more important in accounting for test results at the end of third grade than verbal comprehension, but this picture changes as time goes on. So in 7th grade, verbal comprehension becomes more important, and in 10th grade, then verbal or language comprehension really becomes the salient factor in how well students can, how well they pass those tests that we give them at the end of the year. So the emphasis of instruction should change over time, and the way we talk about the needs of 7th graders or 10th graders should be different from the way we talk about the instructional needs and the apportionment of instructional time for 3rd graders, and then on down below. The issues are really different for beginning readers, for novice readers. And so now, where's the evidence that we as a profession take this seriously and really prepare our teachers to be able to be conversant and fluent in these concepts and be able to explicate all this stuff for kids? Well, the NCTQ report that got a lot of press in 2006 was just pulled no punches. It said much of current reading instruction remains mired in a view of reading that is incompatible with the science. And then it said the process of becoming a reader is described as natural, organic, despite the fact there's no evidence to support such a view, even though it's still very popular. And this reminds me of my most favorite cartoon, which is we have lots of information technology, we just don't have any information, which means we make people go through courses where they learn a lot of stuff, but a lot of that doesn't really get to the heart of the matter of what the issues are for kids who are most dependent on teachers to learn how to read. And then there's the most recent National Council on Teacher Quality from 2013 that did a much larger review of coursework in reading and English language arts and elementary ed. You should look at that if you have not, but the most striking thing that's pertinent for an IDA webinar is that the number of programs with coursework that adequately prepared teachers for strategies to use. This is just strategies to use for struggling readers. This doesn't say anything about real expertise in reading disabilities. 22% versus 78% that got no stars as far as preparing teachers in that way. I have tried with varying success to call attention to this issue, and the reason I'm so motivated is that in my own preparation, as I said before, I didn't learn anything that really equipped me to know what was going on until well after I was responsible for teaching kids, 10 years after. When I got into a doctoral program, and then the light dawned after I had a course in language. So I started writing articles with various people, contributed a chapter to the Snow, Griffin, and Burns book, and so on. And since I kind of stirred the pot, many of my colleagues in research who are far more sophisticated researchers than I've ever been have published many, many papers on the relationship between what teachers know, what they do, and how what they do and what they know affects their students. So here are just some of the things that have come out of these various investigations. One is that what we treat as simple concepts, in fact, if you look at the data, are not known by even the majority of practicing teachers. These are practicing licensed teachers in one state, a very large sample who were asked how the word glue was divided in this with this hyphen, and the answer is onset and rhyme, which is a term written into many state standards, written into tests, written into textbooks. But when you get right down to it, only a third, a little more than a third, were able to identify an onset rhyme division of a word. So we're taking for granted that teachers know these things, when in fact we need to be spending a lot more time explaining, nurturing, and giving enough practice with these basic concepts. We've also been able to document that the complexity of English is a deterrent to teachers to explain the spelling of words, for example, and that many did not receive the requisite information. And since many teachers also went through school at a time when they were not taught explicitly how English works and were kind of left it up to chance or figuring it out on their own or by luck or by chance encounters, we find this kind of thing with this same big sample. It was a random response to this rather complex question, which of the following groups of words is an example of the spelling principle: we spell by the position of a sound in a word, which is one of the major principles of English spelling that you have to know in order to teach spelling beyond a kindergarten level. So this is the answer. The sound is spelled in 3 different ways in these words according to the position of the sound in a word. And there have been other publications that get at things like phoneme awareness in teachers and have compared SLPs to teachers. For example, this was a 2008 study, And what this shows is that while we blithely talk about phoneme awareness, when we actually look at teachers' ability to segment words by phoneme that are a little bit more opaque, should we say, or not as transparent, not as obvious how many phonemes as there are in cat, the success rate goes down precipitously. And actually, this was a paper in a speech and language journal that showed that even SLPs are not entirely proficient with something we seem to treat as if it were simple and obvious when it is not. And then we have studies like Susan Brady's intervention studies that show that philosophy matters. If a teacher comes into a course or a workshop with a certain philosophy in place, they may be receptive or not to what is being taught. So if you came through school with a whole language orientation that taught you that phonics was evil and you shouldn't waste time on that basic stuff and that's mechanical and it's going to turn kids off or whatever, instead of regarding that as the linchpin for learning how to read, you're not going to be responsive to this professional development because you're going to have a filter for that information and you're going to be rejecting it because your schema is already preset. And Anne Cunningham, who's at Berkeley, also did an interesting study on just asking teachers how they would prefer to teach reading. And the majority preferred a literature-based approach. And why is this? Because teaching literature is lots more fun and it's more intuitive, and our preparation programs typically emphasized the idea that if we were teaching reading well, the kids would be really excited about a story and we would be reading the story with them and doing projects around it and getting the kids to act it out or whatever. And that's fine, but if that precludes the teaching of how to read, which has to be, which is really some work that requires some technical know-how and some methodical, it's an inclination to be methodical rather than theatrical, should we say. But you can be theatrical with this stuff too, but that's not as common. So what Anne Cunningham showed was the preferences basically didn't, and this was in a state that had frameworks in place and standards in place that talked a lot about the basic skills of reading and how important they were. But that didn't really affect the preferred practices of the teachers who participated in this study, especially for beginning readers, for novice readers. And then all this, it might not matter if it didn't affect anything, but we do have evidence that when teachers know more, and especially when they know more about the structure of language, then they're more comfortable spending more time on explicit and systematic practices that in fact are the more effective ones with novice readers and struggling readers. So prior knowledge plays a role in teachers' choice of instructional activities. And also we have studies like this one with Nancy Mather's group that shows that students enrolled in K-3 classrooms made the least growth with teachers who understood the least about the spelling system. And that makes sense because none of us can really teach very effectively if we don't understand the content ourselves. And I think that's the biggest deterrent to good spelling and word recognition instruction. Some of the best studies have been done by Deb McCutcheon et al. At the University of Washington because they are year-long studies, and what she's been able to show is that the instruction takes a lot of time, or learning this stuff for her it took a 10-day summer course with the teachers participating all day long. That's 10 days of intensive professional development, and then 3 more days of in-service during the year, plus classroom observation and mentoring from a coach. And when all that happened, the results across a whole range of results, including comprehension, measures of comprehension, were far better with the kids who were in the classrooms with the teachers who received that kind of training and preparation. So it's not just the knowledge base. The knowledge base by itself isn't going to do a whole lot for anybody, because most of us can't automatically take that knowledge base and figure out what to do with it in the classroom. We need models, we need mentoring, we need to be able to see lessons implemented by people who are proficient in delivering the content. That also was a strong effect in Susan Brady's work, also in Louise Spear-Swerling's work. And then there's this study by Shane Piasta, which was in Scientific Studies of Reading in 2009, which I found particularly powerful. This is the leading scientific journal. And what they looked at was, if you give a scripted core curriculum to teachers and just focus on the implementation of that, and you don't focus on what the teachers know and understand and are able to do with that curriculum, it doesn't matter. So the teachers who are in the lower quartile in terms of their own knowledge of the content of language structure were not able to use that scripted program effectively. So it doesn't matter if you have the script right in front of you on the page. If you don't have a sense of what you're trying to communicate to the kids, if you're not in command, if you're not just using that script as a prompt for something that you yourself are trying to communicate to the kids, you may not get a result. So just buying a program, which a lot of districts do, they think it's the solution is, oh, I'll go buy, phonographics, or I'll go buy Wilson Language, or I'll go buy whatever. But we really don't have any money for the professional development. Well, I think they're doing it backwards, because if I had a limited budget, I would, if I were the administrator these days, I would heavily invest in professional development for teachers on the knowledge base to support implementation, heavily invest in really good ongoing embedded mentoring, learning, peer instruction, and then I would make sure everyone had at least very modest handbooks to go by, and there are some very inexpensive things out there that can provide you with the word lists and the lesson plan for the day and whatever, that do not cost an arm and a leg. And the ringer here actually was a study that was a very brave one by Emily Binks Cantrell, Malt Joshi, and Emily Washburn, called The Peter Effect in the Preparation of Reading Teachers. So if we are unsatisfied with the way we were prepared, where does the blame really go back to? Well, it really goes back to those courses we took, or that curriculum that was prescribed for us in teacher training or professional development that did not have the content that we needed. So what those researchers did was examine what the relationship between how university faculty scored on certain items on a survey of knowledge, and compared that to what their teachers were able to do on the same survey. I went by that too fast. So you can see item by item that teachers cannot learn what their faculty members do not know and do not communicate in the coursework. And of course that makes sense. And that brings us to the larger issue of that's being talked about a lot now, which is that many reading courses are taught by adjunct faculty, and the content of those courses is not really monitored, and it's not vetted. They're not accountable to some other reference point or criterion for what really is going to be most important for a new teacher to learn, or for someone getting a degree to learn. And I'll also say that, again, remember that even if you do a better job teaching the content in a course, the job is not done until you figure out what materials to get your hands on, how to actually implement that with kids, and you get pretty sophisticated at knowing with whom you need to do what. So if I could summarize the issue here, why we still need teachers who know a lot about language. Well, a lot of us were licensed in programs that had pretty low standards for what we needed to know when we got out. I am Exhibit A. I was licensed in 3 states, and I would say my education began well after I was licensed, and just because I was lucky to get into a doctoral program where they made me learn about language structure and language development and rigorous instruction. So we know that there are still too many courses that don't have the content. We know that language is often not even on the menu of things for us to learn as reading language arts teachers. We call it language arts, but very few of us actually learn about language. The concepts, now here is something I've not emphasized enough in the past, that as time goes on is more and more apparent to me, and that is that we're talking about concepts that take some time to learn, that are relatively difficult because of the way English is. Concepts, especially about words and how we learn words, are complex and elusive, and they take a lot of time and practice to really learn at a level of fluency that we can be up in front of a class and not be afraid of the question a student would ask. What if a student says, why is does spelled the way it is? Well, I have an answer for that now, but I sure didn't when I started out. And then the application of this knowledge requires really continuous professional development. Teaching is very complex. It's very challenging. We need to constantly be able to plan with others, try out things, get support, evaluate what we're doing, collaborate, and to do that in an atmosphere of support and not the kind of threat that some of us are feeling with the pressures that are coming with teaching. One of the things that IDA has done in the last 4 years is develop the knowledge and practice standards for teachers of reading. And notice that the title of this is Standards for Teachers of Reading. It's not standards for teachers of students with dyslexia, even though that aspect of instruction is embedded in these standards, because every teacher is going to have students in their classroom who have characteristics of dyslexia. We developed these. They have been they have been adopted by ALTA and IMSLEC, and this was the committee that developed the standards. The purpose was to guide preparation, certification, and professional development for all those who teach reading and related literacy skills. and to identify what any individual who's responsible for teaching reading should know and be able to do, so that reading difficulties, including dyslexia, may be prevented or alleviated or remediated. We also aimed to emphasize scientifically based practices and clinically proven practices. So in the development committee, we had clinicians and researchers, and we wanted to protect the interests of the consuming public. There has to be a common reference point. There is in every other profession standards that the public can view as a reference point for evaluating the quality of services that that profession provides. And that's what we intended to do, because we thought that the existing standards that were out there were either insufficient or lacking in detail or not clear enough about scientifically based practices versus philosophies. And I am very pleased with the actions that IDA has taken in the last 3 years. It's just phenomenal leadership from the staff, from Elizabeth Liptak at the office. What we've been able to do with the help of about 40 volunteers in the field is institute a process of review of higher education programs and teacher preparation programs so that we can give this recognition, and now we're going to call it accreditation, to programs that are aligned with the standards. This year we have a whole second round of reviews underway. There are another dozen or so institutions that are asking to be aligned, and we are also in the process of developing properly a professional licensing exam that will be aligned with the standards and that will measure what someone knows in relation to the standards. So all that is underway, and so far I'm very pleased to be able to report that, and you can find this on the IDA website, that all of these institutions passed the review and received IDA recognition in the first round of reviews, and we hope to be able to add another dozen or so places to the list. But if you are an aspiring teacher and you want a master's degree, or you want continuing ed, or you want to advise a colleague about where to get licensed, we now have a list of places where you can be pretty sure that the education you receive will enable you to carry out research-based instruction and will equip you with at least the foundational knowledge and skills that will get you on your way to being a competent professional. We have also accredited the accrediting organizations, INSLEC and NILD, because they accredit teacher preparation and professional development programs as well. So all of this is, tremendous progress from where we have been in the past. So now let me have a look at your questions. Will the PowerPoint be available to review? Yes. I have sent a copy of the PowerPoint in PDF form to the sponsors of the webinar.
Yes, and we will make sure that the PDF, as well as a copy of the Knowledge and Practice Standards for Teachers of Reading, are made available